The first thing you should know about the morning 10 black SUVs showed up outside my house is that I thought the man in my kitchen was just a plumber. His name, at least the name he gave me, was Daniel, and when I opened the door that Tuesday morning in early October, he looked exactly like what you would expect a plumber to look like. Faded work boots, a worn canvas tool bag, and a dark blue work shirt with the sleeves rolled halfway up his forearms. Nothing about him suggested anything unusual. Nothing about him suggested that by noon the quiet street I had lived on for 12 years would be filled with vehicles that looked like they belonged outside a federal courthouse. But that morning started like every other stressful morning I'd had for the past few months. My name is Emily Carter, and at the time all I cared about was the sound of water dripping somewhere under my kitchen sink. It wasn't a loud drip. Just slow, steady drops hitting metal like a tiny clock counting down something I couldn't stop. The house itself wasn't big, about 1,500 square feet with an old porch and a maple tree that had probably been there longer than the neighborhood. But it was mine. Or at least it had been my family's for 3 generations, which meant losing it wasn't just about property taxes or legal paperwork. Losing it meant losing the last thing my parents left behind. The plumbing problem had started the night before. At first it was just a damp cabinet under the sink. By morning there was a thin line of water creeping across the kitchen tile. I had called the only number I could afford, a small local service that promised same-day repairs. That's how Daniel Hayes ended up standing on my front porch at 8:17 a.m. He didn't rush when I opened the door. In fact, the first thing I noticed was how calmly he looked around the yard before stepping inside, like someone quietly taking in every detail. Not suspicious exactly, just careful. "You the one with the leaking pipe?" he asked in a steady voice that carried a hint of warmth without being overly friendly. I nodded and stepped aside to let him in. The house smelled faintly like coffee and old wood, the way older homes always do. Daniel set his tool bag down beside the kitchen sink and crouched to inspect the cabinet. His movements were precise but unhurried, as if time didn't press on him the way it pressed on the rest of us. After a moment he glanced up at me and asked a question that felt oddly personal for a plumber. "How long have you lived in this house?" I hesitated before answering. "Most of my life," I said. He nodded slowly, then returned to examining the pipes. "Old plumbing," he murmured. "But the structure of the house is solid." Something about the way he said that sounded less like a plumber evaluating pipes and more like someone studying the place itself. At the time I brushed the thought aside. My mind was too busy worrying about something else entirely. Because the truth was the leaking pipe wasn't the real problem that morning. The real problem was the letter sitting on my kitchen table. A single envelope from Langford Development Group. Inside was a legal notice telling me I had 30 days to leave the only home I had ever known. And I had a sinking feeling the man behind that letter wasn't finished with me yet. Daniel worked quietly under the sink for several minutes, the faint clink of metal tools echoing softly inside the cabinet while the slow drip of water continued somewhere behind the pipes. I stood near the kitchen table pretending to sort through a stack of mail, but the envelope from Langford Development kept pulling my attention back like a magnet. The letter looked harmless enough, just white paper with black ink and a polished company logo at the top, but every word inside it carried the weight of a deadline I could not escape. 30 days to vacate the property. 30 days to leave the house where my parents had raised me, where my father had planted the maple tree in the front yard the year I turned 8. I folded the letter once more and slid it back into the envelope, hoping Daniel had not noticed the tension in my face. A moment later he leaned back from the cabinet and wiped his hands on a small cloth. "The pipe joint is worn," he said calmly. "Probably original to the house. It just needs a replacement fitting." His voice had the same steady rhythm as before. But then he looked past me toward the kitchen window and added something that caught me off guard. "This neighborhood has changed a lot in the last few years, has it not?" I blinked, surprised by the question. "You could say that," I replied. Daniel nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. "Developers buying property nearby?" he asked. There was something about the way he said the word developers that made it sound less like casual conversation and more like a detail he was quietly confirming. I hesitated before answering. Most of the houses on this block have been sold in the last year, I admitted. A company has been offering cash to homeowners. Daniel slid the new fitting into place beneath the sink, tightening it carefully before turning the water valve back on. The dripping stopped instantly. He watched the pipe for a moment to make sure the seal held, then stood and closed his tool bag. Langford Development, he asked without looking at the letter on the table, but somehow still sounding completely certain. My stomach tightened. How did you know that? I asked. Daniel shrugged slightly, the movement casual enough to seem ordinary. I have seen their trucks around town, he said. They buy property fast. His eyes briefly scanned the kitchen again, pausing on the envelope for only a second before returning to me. Did they make you an offer? I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. More than once, I said. I told them no. Daniel studied my expression for a moment, not with curiosity, but with something closer to quiet understanding. And now they are trying a different approach, he said. I looked down at the envelope again. Something like that. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its tires rolling over the cracked asphalt in front of the house. For a moment the kitchen fell silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the distant rustling of leaves from the maple tree in the yard. Daniel picked up his tool bag and walked toward the sink again, running the water for a few seconds to test the repair. The stream flowed smoothly into the drain without a single drip escaping underneath. That should hold for another 20 years, he said. Then he turned the faucet off and faced me again, his expression calm but thoughtful. Tell me something, Emily, he said quietly. Has anyone from Langford Development come here in person yet? I opened my mouth to answer, but before I could speak there was a sudden sound from outside. The unmistakable rumble of a car engine slowing near the curb directly in front of the house. The engine outside did not belong to the usual morning traffic that passed our street. It idled low and heavy, the kind of sound that made you instinctively look toward the window even before you realized why. I stepped closer to the kitchen window and pulled the curtain slightly aside. A glossy black sedan had stopped at the curb directly in front of the house. It was the type of car that looked out of place on our quiet block where most people drove pickup trucks or older family vehicles. The paint reflected the morning sun like polished glass. My stomach tightened immediately because I already knew who it was before the door even opened. Daniel did not move from where he stood near the sink. Instead he simply watched me with quiet attention, almost as if he had expected this moment to arrive. The driver's side door opened slowly and a tall man stepped out wearing a charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than the mortgage payment on this house. Even from inside I could recognize the sharp posture and practiced confidence. Victor Langford did not look like someone who asked for permission. He looked like someone who assumed every door would open before he even knocked. I had seen him twice before at neighborhood meetings when he introduced himself as a developer interested in revitalizing the area. Revitalizing, in his language, meant buying every home on the block and replacing them with something newer and far more expensive. Daniel walked over beside me and glanced out the window with a calm expression. That would be him, I said quietly. Daniel nodded once as if confirming something he had already suspected. Victor Langford, he said. It was not a question. I folded my arms, trying to keep my voice steady. He has been trying to buy this house for 6 months, I explained. First it was polite offers. Then it was letters. Then it became legal notices. Victor straightened his suit jacket outside and looked around the street briefly before walking toward the front door with confident, measured steps. Each movement carried the quiet assurance of someone who had never been told no for very long. Daniel remained completely still. His expression did not change, but his eyes followed Victor's approach with careful attention. Do you want me to leave before he comes inside? Daniel asked calmly. The question surprised me. I hesitated, glancing between the door and the window again. No, I said finally. You were here first. Daniel gave a small nod and stepped slightly back from the doorway as if giving me space to handle the situation myself. A moment later the doorbell rang. The sound echoed through the hallway like a signal announcing the next chapter of a story I had hoped to avoid. I walked toward the front door slowly, feeling the familiar weight of frustration and exhaustion settling on my shoulders again. When I opened it, Victor Langford stood there with the same polished smile he had worn every time we had met before. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he said smoothly. His voice carried the confident tone of someone delivering good news even when the message was anything but. "I was in the neighborhood and thought it might be a good time for us to talk about your situation." I stepped aside just enough for him to see into the house but not enough to invite him in. "We have already talked about it," I replied calmly. Victor's smile did not fade. Instead it sharpened slightly, like a businessman adjusting his approach during a negotiation. "I believe we have reached the point where conversation becomes necessary," he said. Behind me I could feel Daniel standing quietly in the kitchen, listening without interrupting. Victor's eyes drifted past my shoulder for a moment when he noticed someone else inside the house. His gaze settled briefly on Daniel's work shirt and tool bag before returning to me with mild amusement. "Ah," Victor said lightly. "You have someone fixing the plumbing." Then he looked back at me and added in a tone that sounded almost friendly. "That is good. Because you may want everything in working order before you move out." Victor Langford spoke as if the future of my home had already been decided in a boardroom somewhere far away from this quiet street. His tone carried the polished patience of someone used to negotiating from a position of control. I kept my hand on the edge of the door and did not step aside. "I already told you I am not interested in selling," I said calmly. Victor tilted his head slightly, studying me the way a real estate investor studies a piece of land that has not yet realized its value. "Emily," he said in a voice that sounded almost sympathetic, "this neighborhood is changing whether you like it or not. Development brings opportunity. New infrastructure, new homes, higher property values. Everyone else on this block has already accepted that reality." I did not respond immediately because part of what he said was technically true. Over the past year 3 houses on our street had been sold and replaced with large modern buildings that looked more like luxury rentals than family homes. But the truth behind those sales was simpler. Most of the families who had lived here for decades could not keep up with the rising taxes once developers began circling the area. Victor folded his hands in front of him and leaned slightly closer to the doorway as if sharing something confidential. "You are holding on to a property that is worth far more to me than it is to you," he continued. "And eventually that becomes a difficult position to maintain." His eyes moved past me again, this time settling on Daniel, who still stood quietly near the kitchen counter with his tool bag resting beside the sink. Victor gave a small amused smile. "No offense to your plumber," he said, "but I doubt he plans to live here after you leave." Daniel did not react immediately. He simply watched Victor with the same calm attention he had shown all morning. For a moment the silence between them felt oddly balanced, like two people measuring each other without raising their voices. Victor looked back at me and reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He pulled out a thin folder and held it toward me. "I thought it might help to review the legal timeline together," he said smoothly. "This is a courtesy copy of the notice your attorney should have already received." I did not take the folder. Instead I crossed my arms and looked directly at him. "You mean the eviction notice you sent last week?" I replied. Victor did not deny it. 30 days passes quickly," he said. "Especially when paperwork begins moving through the court system." Behind me Daniel shifted slightly, not in a threatening way, just enough that his presence became more noticeable. Victor glanced toward him again, his expression showing mild curiosity now rather than amusement. "You have been very quiet," Victor said to Daniel. "Most contractors like to offer advice when property matters come up." Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm and steady. "I prefer to listen first." Victor gave a short laugh as if he appreciated the simplicity of that answer. "Well then, you have certainly chosen an interesting morning to listen," he said. I felt a familiar frustration rising in my chest but forced myself to stay composed. "You have said everything you needed to say already," I told Victor. "So unless you are here to repair something else, I think we are finished." Victor looked at me for a moment longer, the polite smile returning to his face like a mask he had practiced wearing. "I admire your persistence," he said quietly. "But persistence does not stop progress." He stepped back from the doorway and adjusted the cuff of his suit. "I will return soon," he added calmly. "And when I do, I suspect the conversation will be much shorter." As he turned to walk back toward his car, Daniel spoke again from inside the house, his tone still calm but carrying a quiet clarity that made Victor pause halfway down the walkway. "Mr. Langford," Daniel said. Victor stopped and turned slightly. "Yes?" Daniel asked a single question that seemed simple on the surface but somehow changed the atmosphere of the moment entirely. "Has this property dispute already been reviewed by a federal compliance officer?" Victor frowned faintly as if the question had not appeared anywhere in the script he expected to follow that morning. Victor Langford remained standing halfway down the walkway, one hand resting casually against the side of his car door while he looked back toward the house. The question Daniel had asked did not sound aggressive or dramatic. It was spoken in the same calm tone he had used all morning, the tone of someone who was simply confirming a detail. But something about the words seemed to shift the balance of the moment. Victor studied Daniel more carefully now, the easy confidence in his expression tightening slightly. "A federal compliance officer," Victor repeated with a faint laugh that sounded more controlled than amused. "That seems like a rather dramatic concern for a plumbing repair." Daniel did not move from his place inside the kitchen. His posture remained relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the counter as if the conversation outside was simply another part of his workday. "It is only dramatic if the paperwork is incorrect," Daniel replied evenly. Victor looked from Daniel to me and back again, trying to decide whether the comment deserved serious attention or polite dismissal. "I assure you," Victor said smoothly, "my company operates within all legal guidelines." Daniel nodded slightly. "I am sure that is what you believe." The answer was so calm that it almost sounded like agreement, yet something in the phrasing made Victor pause again before opening his car door. I stood near the doorway watching both of them, still unsure why Daniel had even asked the question. Victor finally slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, but instead of leaving immediately he rolled down the window and leaned his arm casually against the door frame. "Miss Carter," he said, addressing me again, "you may want to consider the reality of your situation. Development is not something that waits forever." His gaze flicked once more toward Daniel. "And I would advise you not to take legal advice from a plumber." Daniel responded before I could say anything. "That is good advice," he said calmly. "People should always verify the credentials of the person giving them information." Victor gave another short laugh, the sound echoing lightly across the quiet street. "Exactly," he said, as if the point supported his own argument. He lifted a hand in a casual farewell and finally drove away, the black sedan rolling slowly down the street before turning the corner and disappearing from view. The silence that followed felt strangely heavy. I closed the front door and walked back toward the kitchen where Daniel stood beside the sink. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then I looked at him and shook my head slightly. "I appreciate you trying to help," I said, "but asking him questions like that will not change anything." Daniel met my gaze with the same calm expression he had worn all morning. "Perhaps not immediately," he said. "But sometimes questions reveal more than answers." I leaned against the edge of the kitchen table, feeling the exhaustion of the past few months settle over me again. "Victor Langford has lawyers and investors and half the neighborhood behind him," I said quietly. "People like him do not lose property battles." Daniel considered that for a moment before responding. "Sometimes they do," he said simply. I watched him pick up his tool bag and close it carefully, as if his work here had officially finished. "How much do I owe you for the repair?" I asked. Daniel paused for a moment, glancing around the kitchen again with that same observant attention he had shown earlier. "You can settle the bill later," he said. "Today seems busy enough already." I frowned slightly. "Busy?" Daniel nodded once toward the front window. "You might want to look outside again," he said calmly. "Because I do not believe Mr. Langford was the only one planning to visit your house today." I walked slowly toward the window and pulled the curtain aside. At first the street looked exactly the same as it had every morning before this one. Then in the distance, at the far end of the block, I noticed something unusual. One black vehicle had just turned onto our street. Then another appeared behind it. And then another. I stared through the kitchen window as the first black vehicle rolled slowly down our street. It was large and polished, the kind of SUV that looked more suited for government buildings or corporate headquarters than a quiet residential block lined with maple trees and old mailboxes. For a moment I assumed it was simply someone visiting a neighbor. But then a second vehicle turned onto the street behind it. Then a third. They moved in a steady line, each one identical to the one before it, their dark windows reflecting the morning sunlight like mirrors. My fingers tightened around the curtain. "Daniel," I said quietly, not taking my eyes off the street, "do you see this?" Behind me I heard the faint sound of his boots crossing the kitchen floor. He stepped beside me and looked through the window without any sign of surprise. The convoy continued down the block until the first vehicle slowed directly in front of my house. The second stopped behind it. Then the third. Within seconds the quiet street that usually held nothing more than bicycles and parked pickup trucks now had a line of black SUVs stretching nearly halfway down the block. I could already see curtains moving in the houses across the street as neighbors began to notice something unusual was happening. "What is going on?" I whispered, more to myself than to Daniel. He remained silent for a moment, studying the vehicles with the same calm attention he had shown all morning. The engine of the first SUV shut off, followed by the one behind it, and then the others in sequence until the street became strangely quiet again. The only sound left was the faint rustling of leaves from the maple tree in the front yard. One of the SUV doors opened and a man stepped out wearing a dark suit and sunglasses. He looked down at a small device in his hand before speaking briefly into a radio clipped near his collar. Another door opened from a different vehicle and two more people stepped out, dressed in similar suits. None of them appeared rushed. Their movements were precise and coordinated, like professionals arriving at a scheduled meeting rather than strangers appearing in the middle of a neighborhood street. I turned slowly toward Daniel. "Do you know these people?" I asked. Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead he watched as one of the suited men walked up the sidewalk toward my house with measured steps. His expression remained thoughtful but completely composed, as if everything unfolding outside had been expected. "They are early," Daniel said quietly. I blinked, trying to process the meaning of that single sentence. "Early for what?" I asked. Daniel glanced at me briefly before looking back toward the front yard. "For the next part of the morning," he replied. Outside, the man approaching the house stopped near the bottom of the walkway and looked up toward the porch, scanning the property with professional attention. A second man joined him near the sidewalk while the others remained near the vehicles. Across the street, Mrs. Turner from the blue house had stepped out onto her porch with a cup of coffee in her hand, staring openly at the unusual line of black SUVs. I felt my heartbeat quicken as the man at the walkway adjusted his jacket and began walking toward the front door. "Daniel," I said again, my voice quieter now, "what exactly is happening?" Daniel reached down and lifted his tool bag from the kitchen floor as if preparing to leave, then paused near the doorway that led to the front hall. His calm voice carried the same steady tone it had all morning when he finally answered. "Emily," he said gently, "this is the moment when people usually realize that the person fixing their plumbing might not only be a plumber." The words hung in the air for a moment before I fully understood them. I looked at Daniel, then back at the front door as the sound of firm but controlled footsteps moved up the wooden porch outside. My heart was beating faster now, not from fear exactly, but from the strange realization that the quiet morning I had expected was clearly no longer going to continue in any normal way. The doorbell rang again, this time sharper and more deliberate. Daniel stepped past me toward the hallway with the same calm composure he had shown since the moment he arrived. He set his tool bag down near the entryway and adjusted the sleeve of his work shirt as if preparing for something far more formal than a plumbing repair. I stood a few feet behind him, still trying to understand how the situation had changed so quickly. When Daniel opened the door, The man standing on the porch immediately straightened his posture. He was tall, professionally dressed, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who was used to working in structured environments. For a brief moment he looked surprised to see Daniel wearing a work shirt and boots, but the reaction vanished almost instantly. "Good morning, sir," the man said respectfully. "We arrived earlier than expected because traffic was lighter than forecasted." Daniel nodded once. "That is fine, Mark," he replied calmly. "Everything appears to be moving according to schedule." I felt my breath catch slightly when I heard the way the man addressed him. "Sir." "Not plumber." "Not contractor." "Sir." The man on the porch glanced toward the street briefly where the other black SUVs were parked in a long quiet line. 2 more people in suits had stepped out of the vehicles and were speaking quietly beside the curb while occasionally looking toward the house. The entire scene had the organized calm of something planned carefully long before this morning. "The team is ready whenever you are," the man continued. Daniel nodded again and stepped out onto the porch for a moment, speaking quietly with him while I remained inside the doorway. I could not hear every word, but I noticed the man handing Daniel a thin folder while pointing briefly toward the street and then down the block in the direction Victor Langford had driven earlier. Daniel listened without interrupting, then closed the folder and handed it back. "We will begin shortly," he said. "Please give the others a moment." The man nodded and stepped back toward the walkway. Daniel turned and walked back into the house, closing the door behind him with the same calm movement he had used earlier that morning. I stared at him, my mind racing through every possible explanation I could think of. "Daniel," I said slowly, "who are those people?" For the first time since he arrived, he seemed to consider the question carefully before answering. He leaned lightly against the wall near the door, folding his arms in a relaxed posture that somehow made the entire situation feel even stranger. "They are part of a task group," he said simply. I blinked in confusion. "A task group for what?" Daniel glanced toward the kitchen window where the line of black SUVs remained visible through the trees. Then he looked back at me and spoke with the same calm voice that had carried through every conversation since the beginning of the morning. "For reviewing situations where property ownership may not have been handled according to federal housing regulations," he explained. My mind immediately jumped back to Victor Langford's confident smile, the folder he had tried to hand me, and the way Daniel had asked him that question about federal compliance earlier. "Wait," I said quietly as the pieces began to shift into place. "You are not here to fix my plumbing, are you?" Daniel gave a small thoughtful smile, the kind someone gives when a conversation finally reaches the point where the truth becomes obvious. "The pipe did need repair," he said. Then he glanced toward the front door where the quiet line of black SUVs waited outside and added in the same calm tone. "But that was not the primary reason I came here today." For several seconds I simply stood there staring at Daniel as the quiet hum of engines outside drifted faintly through the walls of the house. The man who had arrived that morning carrying a worn canvas tool bag and wearing a work shirt now seemed like a completely different person standing in the same place. Nothing about his posture had changed. Nothing about his calm expression had shifted. But suddenly every detail from earlier in the morning felt different in my memory. The way he had looked around the house when he first stepped inside. The questions he had asked about the neighborhood. The way he had calmly listened while Victor Langford talked about development and legal notices. None of it felt random anymore. "So you knew he would come today," I said slowly, trying to follow the logic of everything that had happened. Daniel did not deny it. He nodded once as if the answer was obvious. "Mr. Langford has been very consistent with his schedule," he said. "People who operate with confidence tend to follow predictable patterns." I glanced toward the window again where the line of black SUVs remained parked along the curb. Across the street, 2 of my neighbors had stepped out onto their lawns pretending to check their mail while clearly watching the unusual scene unfolding in front of my house. "And those people outside," I continued, still trying to process the reality of the situation, "they are part of this investigation." Daniel stepped toward the kitchen window and looked out at the vehicles with the same thoughtful calm he had shown all morning. "They are here to make sure the process happens correctly," he said. Nothing more dramatic than that. I folded my arms, feeling a mixture of confusion and disbelief rising again. You could have told me earlier, I said quietly. Daniel turned back toward me and gave a small understanding nod. Sometimes it is better to see how people behave when they believe no one important is watching, he replied. His words immediately brought Victor Langford's voice back into my memory. The polite smile. The confident tone. The way he had casually suggested that my house would soon belong to someone else. You were testing him, I said. Daniel considered that phrasing for a moment before answering. Observing would be a better word, he said. Outside, one of the suited agents walked halfway up the driveway and spoke briefly into the radio clipped near his collar. A moment later another agent stepped out of the lead SUV carrying a small briefcase. Their movements were quiet and organized, like a team preparing to begin a scheduled meeting. Rather than anything confrontational. I leaned against the edge of the kitchen counter, trying to steady my thoughts. So what happens now? I asked. Daniel glanced toward the front door again before answering. Now we confirm a few details, he said calmly. And then we follow the process that should have happened long before today. I took a slow breath, still struggling to understand how the leaking pipe that had started this morning had somehow led to a federal investigation standing outside my front yard. Does Victor Langford know any of this? I asked. Daniel's expression remained thoughtful as he answered. Not yet, he said. Then he picked up his tool bag from the floor and walked toward the front door again. He paused with his hand on the handle and looked back at me with a calm, reassuring tone. But I suspect he is about to find out. Daniel opened the front door with the same calm, deliberate movement he had used every other time that morning, but stepping outside now felt different, like crossing a quiet line that separated the ordinary world from whatever had been unfolding behind the scenes all along. I followed a few steps behind him and stood near the doorway as the cool air from the street drifted across the porch. The line of black SUVs remained parked neatly along the curb, their polished surfaces reflecting the sunlight and the branches of the maple tree in my yard. The suited man I had seen earlier was waiting near the walkway, holding a thin folder under one arm while speaking quietly into a radio. When he noticed Daniel stepping onto the porch, he immediately ended the transmission and straightened his posture. Sir, he said respectfully, offering the folder again. Daniel accepted it this time and flipped it open briefly, scanning a few pages with a thoughtful expression. The entire exchange lasted less than 10 seconds, but the quiet professionalism of it made the scene feel more official than anything I had experienced in this house before. Two other agents stepped closer from the sidewalk, not crowding the porch but positioning themselves where they could hear the conversation if needed. Daniel closed the folder and handed it back to the man. Thank you, Mark, he said calmly. We will proceed. The man nodded and spoke into his radio again, his voice low but clear enough that I could hear a few words. Team 1 ready. Please notify Unit 2. A moment later another vehicle door opened farther down the street and a woman in a dark blazer stepped out carrying a tablet. She began walking toward the house with steady, confident steps. I watched the quiet coordination of the group, still struggling to connect this scene with the simple plumbing repair I had expected when I called for help that morning. Daniel stepped down from the porch and walked halfway along the front path before turning slightly toward me. Emily, he said in a calm, reassuring voice, I know this looks unusual, but everything you are seeing now is simply part of a review process. I nodded slowly, though the word simple did not feel accurate for a street now filled with official-looking vehicles and people speaking into radios. Across the road, Mrs. Turner had moved closer to her mailbox while pretending to sort through letters she had clearly already read. The woman carrying the tablet reached the walkway and stopped a few feet from Daniel. Documentation has been verified, she said, glancing down at the screen briefly before looking back up. Property ownership history and development filings are ready for review. Daniel nodded once. Good, he replied. Then he looked down the street in the direction Victor Langford had driven earlier that morning. For several seconds he said nothing, as if quietly calculating the timing of events. Finally he turned back to the group of agents gathered near the sidewalk. "We will give Mr. Langford a few minutes," he said calmly. People who operate confidently usually return when they believe the conversation is not finished. The man called Mark nodded in agreement and stepped back toward the vehicles. The street settled again into an unusual quiet, broken only by the faint hum of distant traffic somewhere beyond the neighborhood. I stood on the porch watching Daniel as he looked toward the end of the block, his calm posture unchanged despite the growing attention from curious neighbors. Then, just as he had predicted, the distant sound of a car engine approached from around the corner at the far end of the street, and a familiar black sedan slowly turned back onto the block. The familiar black sedan rolled slowly down the street again, its polished surface reflecting the row of dark SUVs already parked along the curb. I watched from the porch as the car approached, feeling the strange quiet tension that had settled over the neighborhood. Victor Langford clearly had not expected to see half a dozen official vehicles waiting outside the house he had just visited minutes earlier. The sedan slowed noticeably as it drew closer to the line of SUVs, and for a moment it almost looked as if the driver might continue past the house entirely. Instead, the car stopped near the curb across from the driveway. The engine remained running for a few seconds before the driver's side door opened. Victor stepped out again, but this time his confident posture carried a hint of careful calculation rather than the smooth certainty he had shown earlier. His eyes moved quickly across the scene, taking in the vehicles, the suited agent standing along the sidewalk, and Daniel waiting calmly near the walkway. Victor closed the car door slowly and adjusted his jacket, clearly trying to understand the situation before speaking. Daniel remained where he stood, his hands resting loosely at his sides, watching Victor approach with the same composed expression he had carried since the beginning of the morning. Victor walked halfway up the driveway before stopping, glancing briefly at the agents positioned near the vehicles. "This appears to be quite an impressive gathering," he said, forcing a polite smile as his gaze settled on Daniel. "I do not recall scheduling a community meeting." Daniel nodded slightly as if acknowledging the comment without reacting to it. "Good morning again, Mr. Langford," he said calmly. Victor's smile remained in place, though it no longer looked quite as relaxed as it had earlier. "I believe we have already spoken this morning," Victor replied. "Unless your plumbing repair has expanded into something more complicated." Daniel took a small step forward on the walkway, his voice steady and controlled. "In a way, it has," he said. One of the agents nearby opened a briefcase and removed a thin document folder, holding it ready without stepping into the conversation. Victor noticed the movement immediately. His eye shifted from the folder to Daniel and back again. "May I ask what exactly is happening here?" Victor said, the smooth tone of a business executive returning to his voice. Daniel did not rush the answer. Instead, he looked briefly toward the line of SUVs and then back at Victor. "Mr. Langford," he said calmly, "earlier this morning I asked you whether this property dispute had been reviewed by a federal compliance officer." Victor nodded slowly, clearly remembering the question. "And I told you my company operates within all legal guidelines," he replied. Daniel inclined his head slightly. "Yes," he said. "You did." The agent holding the folder stepped forward just enough to offer it to Daniel. Daniel accepted the document and opened it briefly before closing it again. Then he looked directly at Victor and spoke with the same calm voice that had carried through every conversation that morning. "My name is Daniel Hayes," he said. "I am the regional director for the Federal Housing Compliance Task Group." The words seemed to hang in the quiet air of the street. Victor's expression remained composed for a moment, but the confidence behind it clearly shifted as he processed the information. Daniel continued speaking without raising his voice. "Over the past several months our office has been reviewing property acquisition patterns connected to your development company," he explained. "This morning was an opportunity to observe how certain negotiations were being handled." Victor glanced toward the agent again, then back at Daniel. For the first time since he arrived, he appeared to be considering his next words carefully. Daniel's calm expression did not change as he finished the explanation. "And now," he said quietly, "we will begin the formal review process." Victor Langford did not respond immediately. The quiet street seemed to hold its breath as the meaning of Daniel's word settled over the scene. For the first time since he stepped out of his car that morning, Victor's confident posture shifted slightly, not dramatically, but enough that anyone paying attention could see the careful calculation beginning behind his expression. He looked from Daniel to the agent standing near the vehicles and then toward the folder in Daniel's hand. When he finally spoke, his voice still carried the controlled tone of a businessman who had spent years negotiating complex deals. "I see," Victor said slowly. "So this is some kind of regulatory review." Daniel nodded once. "That would be an accurate description," he replied calmly. Victor glanced toward the neighboring houses where several residents now stood openly watching from their lawns and porches. The quiet attention of the neighborhood had turned the entire street into an unexpected stage. Victor returned his gaze to Daniel and gave a small polite smile. "Then I am sure this is simply a misunderstanding," he said. "My company has purchased properties throughout this city for years. Everything has been conducted through legal channels." Daniel listened without interrupting, his calm expression unchanged. One of the agents standing near the sidewalk stepped forward and handed another document to the woman with the tablet, who quickly scanned the information before nodding to Daniel. The quiet efficiency of the team made the entire process appear routine, as if they had handled similar situations many times before. Daniel turned the folder slightly so Victor could see the cover page without handing it over. "Over the last 18 months, Daniel said in the same steady tone, Langford Development has acquired or attempted to acquire 17 residential properties within a 2-mile radius of this block." Victor gave a brief nod as if confirming something obvious. "That is correct," he said. "Urban development requires consolidation of property. It is a standard business practice." Daniel continued speaking calmly. "In several of those cases, the acquisitions were followed by rapid property tax reassessments and eviction notices issued shortly afterward." Victor's smile returned, though it now looked more carefully controlled. "Market adjustments happen," he replied. "Neighborhoods evolve." Daniel inclined his head slightly. "That is true," he said. "However, federal housing law requires that certain processes be followed when acquisition patterns begin to affect long-term residential stability." The woman with the tablet stepped closer and quietly showed Daniel a screen displaying several lines of property records. Daniel glanced at it briefly before looking back at Victor. "Earlier this morning," Daniel said, "you informed Ms. Carter that she should prepare to leave this property within 30 days. Victor's eyes flicked briefly toward me standing on the porch before returning to Daniel. "That notice was issued by legal counsel," he said smoothly. Daniel nodded again. "Yes," he replied. "And part of our review today involves determining whether those notices were issued appropriately." The agent standing along the sidewalk remained silent, their presence calm but unmistakably official. Victor adjusted the sleeve of his suit jacket and looked back toward his car for a moment before turning again to Daniel. "Director Hayes," he said, using the title carefully, "I am confident that once your office reviews the complete documentation you will find everything perfectly in order." Daniel closed the folder slowly and met Victor's gaze with the same steady calm that had carried through the entire morning. "That is exactly what we intend to determine," he said. Then he gestured lightly toward the agents waiting nearby. "Our team will begin reviewing the documentation now." Victor remained standing on the driveway for a moment longer, watching as the agents moved quietly into position with their folders and tablets. Across the street the neighbors continued to observe the scene in silence. Daniel stepped back toward the porch and looked briefly at me before turning his attention to the team again. The calm authority in his voice did not change as he spoke the next sentence. "Please begin the compliance review." The quiet efficiency of the task group transformed the atmosphere of the street within minutes. Agents moved calmly between the vehicles and the walkway, speaking in low voices and occasionally checking information on their tablets or reviewing documents from thin folders. Nothing about their behavior looked rushed or dramatic. Instead, it carried the quiet rhythm of professionals doing work they had done many times before. Victor Langford remained standing near the driveway, watching the activity unfold with a careful expression that now looked far more measured than the confident smile he had worn earlier that morning. From the porch I could see the shift clearly. The certainty that had filled his voice before had been replaced by the focused attention of someone trying to evaluate a situation that was no longer entirely under his control. Daniel stood beside the front steps with his hands loosely folded, observing the review process without interfering. Every now and then one of the agents would approach him quietly with a document or a question, and he would respond with a brief instruction before the agent returned to the group. The entire scene remained calm, orderly, and strangely quiet for something that had drawn the attention of half the neighborhood. Across the street, Mrs. Turner had now been joined by two other neighbors who stood near the sidewalk pretending to discuss gardening while clearly watching every movement happening in front of my house. The woman carrying the tablet approached Daniel again after several minutes, turning the screen slightly so he could read the information displayed there. Daniel studied the screen carefully before nodding once. "Confirm the acquisition timeline for the 3 properties purchased last winter," he said calmly. The woman nodded and walked back toward the agents near the vehicles. Victor finally stepped a little closer to the walkway, addressing Daniel again with a polite but noticeably more careful tone. "Director Hayes," he said, "I hope your team understands that large development projects require complex property negotiations. Some situations may appear unusual when viewed individually." Daniel listened patiently before answering. "That is precisely why we review the complete pattern," he replied. Victor folded his arms thoughtfully, glancing once more toward the agents who were now quietly comparing documents beside the lead SUV. "And if your review finds that everything was handled properly?" Victor asked. Daniel gave a small acknowledging nod. "Then the process concludes and everyone continues their work," he said simply. For a moment neither man spoke. The only sound was the distant rumble of traffic somewhere beyond the neighborhood and the faint rustling of leaves overhead. Then one of the agents approached Daniel carrying a folder that looked thicker than the others. The agent handed it to him quietly and pointed to several pages inside. Daniel opened the folder and reviewed the documents carefully, his expression thoughtful but steady. After a moment he closed the folder again and looked toward Victor. "Mr. Langford," he said calmly, "it appears that several acquisition notices connected to your company were issued before required notification periods had been completed." Victor's expression tightened slightly, though he quickly regained his composure. "That sounds like a clerical misunderstanding," he replied. Daniel nodded as if acknowledging the possibility. "That is one explanation," he said. Then he gestured lightly toward the agents continuing their work along the curb. "Which is why our team is here to verify the full record." I stood quietly on the porch listening to the conversation, realizing that the quiet repair visit that had begun with a leaking pipe had somehow turned into something far more significant. Daniel's calm voice carried across the driveway again as he spoke to the agents reviewing the documents. "Continue the review," he said. "We will confirm every filing before the final determination is made." The review continued quietly for several more minutes, the agents comparing documents, checking timestamps, and confirming records through their tablets while the line of black SUVs remained parked along the curb like silent witnesses. The entire scene had the calm rhythm of professionals finishing a job they already understood. I watched from the porch as Daniel stood near the walkway, his posture relaxed but attentive, occasionally responding to a question from one of the team members. Victor Langford had moved a few steps away toward his car, though he remained close enough to hear the conversation unfolding. His expression had changed again, not dramatic or emotional, but noticeably more restrained than when he first arrived earlier that morning with confident predictions about my future. After several minutes the woman with the tablet approached Daniel once more, holding the device where he could clearly see the screen. She spoke quietly, but the calm tone of her voice carried across the driveway. "The documentation confirms the sequence," she said. "Multiple acquisition notices were issued before the required notification windows had closed." Daniel studied the screen for a moment, then nodded slowly. The folder he held remained closed in his hand as he turned slightly toward Victor. "Mr. Langford," Daniel said calmly, "our review indicates that several notices connected to your company were issued prematurely under federal housing guidelines." Victor did not interrupt this time. He listened carefully, his eyes moving briefly toward the agent standing along the sidewalk and then back to Daniel. Daniel continued speaking with the same steady tone that had defined every word he had said since the beginning of the morning. Because of that sequence, those notices will be suspended until the proper review period has been completed. The word settled into the quiet street like the final piece of a puzzle. Victor's shoulders lowered slightly as he absorbed the information. Suspended, he repeated slowly. Daniel nodded once. Correct, he said. Until the process is reviewed according to the appropriate timeline. Victor looked briefly toward my house and then back at Daniel. For a moment he seemed ready to argue, but the calm presence of the task group standing along the street made it clear that the conversation had already moved beyond negotiation. Instead he gave a short controlled nod. Very well, he said quietly. Daniel turned to the agents and gave a small signal with his hand. Please finalize the report and forward the documentation, he said. Several of the agents began closing their folders and returning to the vehicles, their movements efficient and organized. The quiet line of SUVs that had transformed the street into an unexpected stage now looked as if it would soon disappear just as calmly as it had arrived. Victor opened the door of his sedan but paused before getting inside. He glanced once more toward Daniel and then toward me standing on the porch. Without another word he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine. A moment later the car rolled slowly down the street and turned the corner, leaving the neighborhood quieter than it had been all morning. Daniel watched the sedan disappear before turning back toward the porch. The agents were already returning to their vehicles, their work apparently complete. Daniel walked up the steps with the same calm presence he had shown when he first arrived with his tool bag earlier that day. For a moment he simply looked around the yard, the maple tree, the old porch railing, the house that had been my family's for decades. Then he looked back at me with a small thoughtful smile. Your plumbing should hold for another 20 years, he said calmly. I let out a slow breath that I had not realized I had been holding all morning. The quiet street around us was beginning to return to normal again as the first SUV started its engine and slowly pulled away from the curb. Daniel picked up his tool bag and stepped down from the porch, preparing to leave the same way he had arrived. As the vehicles began to drive away one by one, the calm words he had spoken earlier that morning echoed in my mind again. Sometimes the person fixing a pipe is also fixing something much larger.